The First World War was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. Europe had burned for 4 years, and when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the victors promised a new world, one built on peace, democracy, and prosperity. But for Italy, that promise turned to dust. Italy had joined the Allies in 1915, hoping to gain territories and prestige. Its soldiers fought and died in brutal mountain battles, and the cost was staggering. Over 600,000 dead, an economy in ruins, and a population haunted by loss. Yet, when the peace treaties were signed, Italy received little of what it had been promised. Newspapers called it a mutilated victory. National pride turned into national humiliation. Factories closed, inflation soared, and food shortages hit the working class. Returning veterans found no jobs, no support, and no gratitude. They wandered the streets in worn uniforms, ignored by the very nation they had fought to defend. Amid this despair, the old political order crumbled. Parliament seemed weak, divided, and out of touch. Socialists called for revolution. Industrialists feared chaos. Everywhere, there was a sense that Italy had lost not just a war, but its very soul. It was in this atmosphere of fear, confusion, and resentment that a former socialist journalist named Benito Mussolini saw his opportunity. Once a fiery editor for the socialist newspaper Avanti, Mussolini had been expelled from the party for supporting the war. But exile had given him freedom, the freedom to reinvent himself. He realized something profound about politics. People were no longer moved by ideology, they were moved by emotion. They didn't crave analysis, they craved conviction. They didn't want to think, they wanted to feel. And Mussolini gave them exactly that. In 1919, he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, a movement that mixed nationalism, anti-communism, and theatrical aggression. His followers, known as the Black Shirts, wore uniforms, marched in formation, and projected power wherever they went. They attacked labor unions, beat up socialists, and burned newspaper offices. To many Italians, they seemed violent. To others, they seemed like the only ones taking action while the government argued endlessly. Mussolini's genius lay in performance. He wasn't merely a politician, he was an actor on the grandest stage of all. He gave rousing speeches filled with passion, gestures, and drama. He shouted, pounded his fists, stared into the crowd until they felt hypnotized. He didn't promise policies, he promised destiny. Through newspapers and radio, the social media of his time, he built an image of himself as the savior of Italy. His propaganda machine portrayed him as a soldier, a worker, a thinker, a father, a man of all people, for all people. He declared, "I am not a man. I am a symbol. I am the nation." By 1921, the movement had grown rapidly, feeding on chaos. Italy was divided between strikes, peasant revolts, and government paralysis. In the north, factories were being seized by workers. In the countryside, landowners feared revolution. When Mussolini's Black Shirts marched into towns, they were greeted not with resistance, but with relief. People believed they brought order. In October 1922, Mussolini made his boldest move yet, the March to Rome. Thousands of his followers gathered outside the capital, demanding power. In truth, it was more theater than revolution. The Black Shirts were poorly armed and disorganized. But the image of masses in black uniforms, saluting and chanting, terrified the political elite. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, refused to declare martial law. Instead, he summoned Mussolini and offered him the position of prime minister. And just like that, with a single signature, Italy's democracy collapsed. Mussolini hadn't overthrown the government, he'd seduced it. Once in power, he moved swiftly to dismantle democratic institutions. Opposition parties were banned, newspapers censored, dissent silenced. Yet millions of Italians cheered him on. He gave them parades, slogans, and pride. He told them they were part of something bigger, a revival of the Roman Empire. He turned politics into spectacle, blending myth and propaganda into a new kind of emotional religion. Mussolini's Italy became the blueprint of modern populism. Find a wounded nation. Blame the weak, the outsiders, the corrupt elite. Promise a return to greatness. And above all, make the people believe that you, and only you, are the embodiment of their will. Across the continent, leaders were watching. They saw how a man with a newspaper and a few thousand angry followers had transformed himself into the leader of a nation. Among them was a young, bitter World War I veteran named Adolf Hitler. In the beer halls of Munich, Hitler raged against defeat, humiliation, and the Treaty of Versailles. Like Mussolini, he saw that people didn't crave democracy, they craved dignity. And dignity, he believed, could only be restored through unity and obedience. Hitler studied Mussolini's methods, the uniforms, the marches, the symbolism, the emotion. He built the Nazi Party as a mirror of Italian fascism, but deadlier, more radical, and infused with racial ideology. By 1933, Germany followed Italy's path. The same formula worked again. Chaos breeds fear. Fear seeks order. Order arrives wearing a populist mask. In Spain, Francisco Franco adopted a similar playbook during the Civil War. In Argentina, Juan Perón learned how to use charisma, nationalism, and media to build emotional bonds with the masses. Populism was no longer an Italian experiment. It was becoming a global language of power. What Mussolini had invented was not just fascism, it was emotional populism, a politics that bypassed reason and went straight for the gut. It relied on myths of betrayal, nostalgia for lost greatness, and the creation of a single unifying story, us versus them. The them could be anyone, communists, capitalists, foreigners, minorities, as long as they could be blamed for the people's suffering. In this emotional battlefield, truth didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of belonging, the thrill of unity, the illusion of strength. By the late 1930s, populism had mutated into totalitarianism. Millions would die because of the emotional machinery Mussolini first set in motion. But even when fascism was defeated in 1945, its emotional power survived. After the war, the world promised never again. Yet, beneath the rubble of destroyed cities, the psychology of populism endured. It reappeared in new forms, adapted to new times. The grand rallies became televised speeches. The posters turned into political ads. The microphones gave way to television cameras. The populace didn't need a uniform anymore, only a voice and a story that made people feel. As the 20th century unfolded, populism morphed into something subtler, blending democracy with demagoguery, patriotism with paranoia, and freedom with fear. From Mussolini's balcony speeches to televised rallies, and eventually social media live streams, the goal remained the same: to control the emotional temperature of the nation. Mussolini may have fallen, but his legacy endured, not as a man, but as a method that would inspire countless others who learned that politics wasn't about facts, but feelings, not about truth, but storytelling. Populism was never just a political strategy, it was emotional theater, and the audience, as always, was the people themselves. As Italy entered the post-war years, the world turned its eyes toward reconstruction and peace. But the ghost of Mussolini lingered, whispering to future generations of leaders who would face new crises, new enemies, and new technologies of persuasion. They would learn his core lesson: to rule the people, you must first perform for them. And in the century that followed, from Latin America to Europe, from the television age to the Twitter era, that performance never stopped. The story of modern populism began not with speeches or manifestos, but with one man on a balcony, raising his arm and convincing millions that he was their destiny. The curtain had risen on a new kind of politics, one that would survive wars, revolutions, and generations. A politics driven not by ideas, but by emotion. Not by democracy, but by drama. And it all began with Mussolini. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the world swore it had learned its lesson. The dictators were gone, their empires in ruins, their dreams buried under the rubble of cities they had destroyed. But ideas don't die with men. They adapt, they disguise themselves, they wait. The post-war world was meant to be one of peace and progress. New democracies were born. Institutions like the United Nations rose to promise global cooperation, and a generation scarred by conflict yearned for normalcy. But beneath that yearning ran a familiar current: fear, uncertainty, and the desire for strong direction. In Europe, millions were displaced, economies were shattered. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a new kind of anxiety. Two superpowers faced each other across a divided world, each promising salvation, each claiming moral superiority. And once again, amid the noise of rebuilding, people began looking for voices that made them feel safe. Populism, stripped of its fascist uniform, was reborn. In the ashes of Europe and across the seas in Latin America, new populists emerged not as soldiers or dictators, but as saviors in suits. They spoke the language of the people. They promised dignity, prosperity, and national pride. They replaced military parades with microphones and propaganda posters with televised smiles. The theater of power was about to find its newest stage: the screen. If Mussolini invented emotional populism, Juan Perón perfected it. A decorated officer in Argentina's army, Perón rose from obscurity during the 1940s through a mix of charm, cunning, and timing. The country was restless, caught between industrial ambition and deep inequality. Perón's genius was understanding that populism didn't need ideology, it needed empathy, or at least the performance of it. He spoke the language of the worker, visited factories, shook hands, and promised to make Argentina great for all its citizens, not just the elite. But his greatest weapon was not his uniform, it was his partner. Evita Duarte de Perón, Evita, was a radio actress who knew how to command attention. Together, they built a movement that was part politics, part religion, and entirely theater. Crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo chanting their names. Women wept at Evita's speeches. Workers carried her portrait as if it were a holy icon. Perón and Evita understood that in the age of emotion, the line between politics and performance could disappear completely. Their message was simple: the people versus the powerful. They nationalized industries, increased wages, and vilified the wealthy. Critics called it demagoguery. Supporters called it justice. The truth was somewhere in between, and it didn't matter. In populism, emotion is the truth. By the late 1940s, Perón's Argentina had become the model for a new generation of populist leaders in Latin America. Men like Getulio Vargas in Brazil and Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. They fused nationalism, social welfare, and spectacle into a potent new formula: populism with a human face. But every performance ends. When Evita died in 1952, the magic cracked. Without her, Perón's image dimmed, and soon, military officers who once supported him turned against him. He fled into exile, but his style would echo for decades, from Hugo Chávez to Jair Bolsonaro. Across the ocean, another stage awaited. this time in the United States. The war had ended with America triumphant, but peace quickly curdled into paranoia. The Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb in 1949. China fell to communism, and the fear of infiltration gripped American life. It was a perfect storm for a new kind of populist, one who could turn suspicion into spectacle. That man was Senator Joseph McCarthy. In 1950, McCarthy claimed he had a list, hundreds of communists secretly working inside the U.S. government. He offered no proof, only passion. But in the early days of television, passion was enough. Night after night, McCarthy appeared before cameras, waving papers, naming names, accusing enemies. He wasn't selling evidence, he was selling fear. Millions watched, riveted and horrified. He framed every question as a battle for America's soul. Patriots versus traitors. Good versus evil. Once again, the formula worked. Find a crisis, invent an enemy, promise salvation. The hearings became theater. Careers were destroyed, lives ruined, all in the name of protecting the nation. But eventually, the spectacle consumed itself. When journalist Edward R. Murrow challenged McCarthy on live television, showing America the bullying and lies behind the drama, the senator's spell broke. His fall was swift, but his method endured. McCarthy had proven that populism didn't require rallies or uniforms anymore. It only needed a camera. By the 1960s, television had transformed politics completely. For the first time in history, voters didn't just hear leaders, they saw them. It was no longer about speeches, it was about presence. When John F. Kennedy faced Richard Nixon in the first televised U.S. presidential debate in 1960, the world witnessed the birth of a new political truth. Image could overpower argument. Nixon spoke well, but he looked tired, pale, unshaven. Kennedy, by contrast, appeared calm, confident, radiant, the embodiment of youth and optimism. Those who listened on radio thought Nixon had won. Those who watched on TV knew Kennedy had. The camera had become the new stage of populism. Kennedy wasn't a demagogue, but he mastered the emotional power of performance. His charm, his family, his rhetoric, all crafted an aura of intimacy and hope. When he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," millions felt personally spoken to. Politics had entered the age of emotion once more, but now mediated through technology. The leader no longer needed to shout to be heard. He only needed to connect. Through the 1960s and 70s, populism adapted across continents. In France, Charles de Gaulle rebranded nationalism as pride and unity. In India, Indira Gandhi spoke directly to the poor, declaring "Garibi Hatao," eradicate poverty. In the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos promised discipline and rebirth, until his populism turned into dictatorship. In Latin America, populism fused with revolution. In the West, it merged with television marketing. It could wear the mask of left or right, democracy or dictatorship. The core emotion remained the same. We, the people, against them. And the them changed with every decade. Sometimes it was the elite, sometimes foreigners, sometimes the media itself. But always it was the fuel of belonging, outrage, and hope that kept populism alive. By the late 19th century, populism had learned to survive in any environment, authoritarian or democratic. It didn't need to seize power by force anymore. It could simply win elections through emotion. Television gave rise to a new kind of populist, smooth, polished, media-savvy. Ronald Reagan, a former actor, understood the camera better than anyone. He smiled, joked, and told stories that made people feel good about America again. He promised strength without shouting, unity without ideology, the populism of comfort. The cycle had come full circle. From Mussolini's balcony to Kennedy's broadcast, from fear to faith, from dictatorship to democracy, populism had become part of the democratic bloodstream. It no longer lived on the fringes. It was the mainstream. Populism didn't die in the ruins of World War II. It changed costume. It traded uniforms for microphones, rallies for ratings, and threats for smiles. But its essence, the emotional bond between the leader and the people, remained untouched. As the century turned, new technologies waited just beyond the horizon. The internet, the smartphone, the algorithm, and soon populism would find its most powerful stage yet, a digital empire where every citizen could be both audience and actor. By the mid-20th century, the world was split in two, not just by ideology, but by image. The Cold War was as much a war of perception as it was of power. Democracy and communism were locked in a battle to win hearts and minds, and in this struggle, the populace learned to master the camera. Television emerged as the new weapon of mass persuasion. No longer confined to fiery speeches in town squares, populist leaders could now enter the living room of every citizen. Politics became entertainment. Charisma became currency. The world had stepped into the age of image politics. In the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy perfected the art of fear. Standing before television cameras, he accused countless Americans of being secret communists. His message was simple, emotional, and terrifying, that the enemy was among us. McCarthy's crusade against invisible threats captured the same populist energy Mussolini had once channeled, a politics of paranoia, fueled by spectacle. Across the Atlantic, Europe was rebuilding itself from ruins. Nations torn apart by fascism and war sought unity, yet populism found new ground. Charles de Gaulle of France rose as a savior figure, embodying both national pride and resistance to foreign domination. His speeches blended patriotic fervor with theatrical authority, positioning himself not as a politician, but as the living symbol of France itself. In Latin America, a new brand of populism took root, the populism of the masses. Argentina's Juan and Eva Perón understood the emotional chemistry between power and people. They harnessed the radio and public rallies to create an almost religious devotion. Eva, the spiritual leader of the nation, became a saintly figure for the poor and working class, while Juan spoke of social justice and anti-elitism. Together, they transformed populism into a movement of emotional belonging, the promise that the people suffering would be redeemed by love and loyalty to the leader. Populism had evolved. It was no longer defined solely by ideology, but by the performance of empathy. Whether from the right or left, its essence lay in the ability to dramatize struggle, to make politics feel personal again. Television magnified that intimacy. In the U.S., the 1960 presidential debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon became a turning point. Kennedy's calm confidence and visual charm outshone Nixon's anxious demeanor. Those who watched on TV favored Kennedy. Those who only heard the radio broadcast leaned toward Nixon. The camera, not policy, decided the victor. This was the new populist medium. Not newspapers or manifestos, but screens and sound bites. Politics had become a theater of emotion, where leaders sold hope, fear, and identity through performance. By the 1960s and 70s, populism had adapted to every continent. In India with Indira Gandhi, in Indonesia with Sukarno, in the Philippines with Ferdinand Marcos. Each promised to restore national pride and confront corrupt elites using mass media to mold their image as the ultimate protector of the people. Populism was no longer a rebellion. It was a language, fluent, emotional, and cinematic. As the Cold War intensified, populism began to globalize, not through armies or revolutions, but through media, marketing, and myth. The populist leader became a brand, and nations became audiences. The 1980s marked a turning point. Economic liberalization and global communication networks gave rise to a new kind of populist, the media-savvy reformer. They promised to make nations great again by unleashing markets, reviving patriotism, and dismantling bureaucratic elites. In the United States, Ronald Reagan epitomized this transformation. A former Hollywood actor, he understood that the key to power lay in narrative. Reagan's America was a story, a nostalgic dream of shining cities and moral renewal. His speeches were cinematic, his smile rehearsed, his populism polished. Yet beneath the optimism was the same old formula, a righteous people versus an unaccountable establishment. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher offered a parallel performance. She framed herself as the voice of ordinary Britons against unions, intellectuals, and bureaucrats. Her iron resolve, paired with populist rhetoric of hard work and discipline, transformed conservative politics into a moral crusade. She was not just governing a country, she was selling a world view. Elsewhere, the populist model adapted to local contexts. Fidel Castro maintained revolutionary charisma through endless televised speeches, while Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran used cassette tapes, the social media of his time, to spread a populist Islamic revival. Both rejected Western elites and spoke directly to the oppressed, reinforcing the emotional narrative of purity versus corruption, authenticity versus arrogance. As global media networks expanded, so did the populist reach. Satellite television and early digital communication allowed leaders to project themselves as mythic figures, protectors of faith, family, and identity, even in places they'd never visit. By the end of the Cold War, the stage was set for a new era. Populism had absorbed modern technology and globalized its appeal. It could thrive in democracies and dictatorships alike, wrapping itself in the language of freedom or faith, nationalism or justice, whatever voice would best echo through the screens. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized not just the end of ideological division, but the triumph of performance politics. As the world celebrated liberal democracy, few realized that the populist had already learned how to thrive within it. Elections became shows, slogans replaced policies, emotion triumphed over reason. In the decades that followed, populism would evolve again, not from pulpits or podiums, but from the internet. It would no longer need rallies or parades. It would live in screens, feeds, and algorithms. But before the digital storm, there was one last rehearsal: the rise of the post-Cold War populists who would turn democracy itself into a spectacle. When the 21st century began, the world seemed poised for a new age of reason, a time when information, connectivity, and technology promised to empower citizens rather than divide them. The Cold War had ended, and a sense of optimism filled the air. Globalization was hailed as the engine of prosperity, promising new opportunities for commerce, culture, and communication. The Internet was celebrated as humanity's great equalizer. Vast networks of connectivity promised to dismantle traditional hierarchies, replacing them with horizontal, participatory forms of communication. Ordinary citizens, once passive consumers of news and politics, could now take part in public discourse in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. Social media shattered the barriers between private life and public debate. Suddenly, ordinary people could broadcast opinions, mobilize supporters, and challenge institutions, all from a screen in their pocket. The gatekeepers of information, editors, journalists, and political elites were bypassed, often within minutes. This digital empowerment created a new kind of populism, one born not in town halls or broadcast studios, but in timelines, comment threads, and viral posts. Populism had always thrived on emotion, the politics of us versus them. Yet in the digital age, emotion itself became quantifiable. Algorithms turned outrage, fear, and moral certainty into measurable data, prioritizing content that generated clicks, shares, and reactions. Leaders no longer needed mass rallies to galvanize support. A single tweet could spark a movement. Small voices could be amplified into global megaphones. In this ecosystem, the people were not merely an audience, they were the content itself. Each like, share, or repost became a digital referendum, a symbolic vote on truth, morality, and influence. The early 2000s carried a sense of techno-utopianism. Events like the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, and countless grassroots campaigns seemed to prove the democratic promise of digital populism. Activists used Facebook, Twitter, and emerging platforms to organize protests, topple dictators, and demand accountability. Governments, once insulated from citizen activism, were suddenly vulnerable to movements that previously required armies and months of planning. The world watched as ordinary citizens, empowered by digital tools, seemed to reclaim political agency. Yet the same tools that united could also divide. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement often promoted sensationalism over nuance. Lies could travel faster than truths, while polarizing messages drowned out measured discourse. Outrage became a currency, and extreme voices were rewarded with visibility. The very networks that promised empowerment created echo chambers, amplifying bias and reinforcing pre-existing divisions. The 2008 financial crisis highlighted this tension. While traditional media offered detailed analyses of failing banks and economic policy, social media simplified complex narratives into emotionally charged stories. Banks versus people, elites versus citizens. These narratives resonated widely. Movements like Occupy Wall Street were inspired, but social media also accelerated conspiracy theories, distrust, and political polarization. In the digital age, rational citizens often became emotional participants in a theater of outrage. Digital populism was no longer an ideology, it was an emotional feedback loop. Power shifted from institutions to platforms, from representatives to algorithms. Politicians quickly realized that the medium could shape the message. They no longer needed lengthy policy proposals or careful speeches. A well-timed tweet, a viral video, or a controversial meme could achieve influence and loyalty. Emotional resonance mattered more than factual accuracy. Engagement, not governance, became the metric of success. This transformation was global. Leaders from Iceland to Indonesia, Brazil to Poland discovered that viral content could shape elections, public opinion, and the social imagination. Platforms once considered neutral tools became powerful instruments of political engineering. Every trending hashtag was a battlefield, every viral video a weapon. Citizens were no longer passive recipients of news,
They were participants, amplifiers, and sometimes unwitting vectors of manipulation. In this environment, political literacy alone was insufficient. Critical thinking collided with engineered emotion. Populists exploited deep-seated fears, economic insecurity, cultural displacement, national humiliation, and transformed them into digital mobilization. Societies became divided along emotional lines rather than ideological ones. Social cohesion was replaced with performative loyalty, and the digital crowd became both the audience and the performer.
But by the 2010s, the internet had transformed from a tool of connection into a global stage. And on this stage, a new kind of populist emerged. Not just politicians, but digital performers. They understood something traditional leaders often overlooked. In the algorithmic world, authenticity is performance, and conflict drives engagement. Every viral outburst, every controversial remark, every meme was carefully engineered, a spark to feed the algorithm and keep the audience watching. Reality became negotiable. Perception outweighed objective truth. Donald J. Trump's rise epitomized this shift. His political ascent was not accidental, but symptomatic of a broader transformation in how power was projected and perceived. Trump didn't merely use social media, he ruled through it. Twitter became his podium, his weapon, and his megaphone. Supporters viewed his unfiltered style as proof of authenticity, while opponents' outrage validated his appeal. In this digital age, emotional resonance mattered more than policy coherence or fact-checking. The medium amplified the message, turning performance into political power. Globally, similar patterns emerged. Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, India's Narendra Modi, the Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte, and Italy's Beppe Grillo all harnessed social media to speak directly to citizens, bypassing traditional institutions. Each presented themselves as the voice of the silenced majority, accusing media and establishment actors of deception. Through YouTube videos, WhatsApp forwards, TikTok clips, and viral memes, these leaders communicated with citizens in a language that prioritized emotional impact over rational argument. Even opposition forces adopted these methods. Emotional storytelling, viral symbolism, and meme-driven campaigns became standard tools in modern politics. Populism, once considered a movement of the fringes, became an operational framework for global democracy. Political debate was no longer measured in policy differences, but in narrative virality, emotional resonance, and digital performance. Identity replaced argument. Outrage became addictive. Online echo chambers magnified biases, while coordinated disinformation campaigns manipulated millions. The distinction between persuasion and manipulation blurred. The 2016 U.S. presidential election demonstrated the full power of these techniques. Micro-targeting, bot amplification, and coordinated campaigns allowed actors, domestic and foreign, to shape narratives, exploit vulnerabilities, and influence outcomes. Platforms designed for connection had become arenas of psychological warfare. And yet, citizens often felt empowered, believing their participation reflected informed choice, even as algorithms guided behavior. The rise of digital populism reshaped governance itself. Leaders mastering online persuasion could bypass legislatures, influence courts, manipulate international opinion, and mobilize voters instantly. Checks and balances, built for slower modes of communication, struggled under the pressure of 24-hour virality. A single 280-character tweet could destabilize markets, inflame diplomatic tensions, and mobilize millions, all outside traditional channels. Yet, at its core, populism remained consistent. The people have been betrayed, and only an outsider can restore their sovereignty. The medium changed, from balconies to broadcast studios, from TV to Twitter, but the underlying narrative endured. The personal became political, and the emotional became universal. By the late 2010s, populism had entered its most global, instantaneous, and algorithmic phase. Political theater, propaganda, and emotion no longer belonged to rallies or newspapers. They were magnified across continents in real time. Social media, once celebrated as a democratic tool, had become a catalyst for polarization. Hashtags replaced banners. Live streams replaced speeches, and memes replaced manifestos. The audience, as always, remained both spectator and participant. The digital populist era revealed a stark truth. Politics is emotional, and the medium magnifies its impact. Facts, evidence, and institutions were secondary to narrative, performance, and perception. Hashtags could topple governments, digital mobs could redefine truth, and the illusion of connection became one of the most powerful tools in modern political strategy. By the dawn of the 2020s, the world had entered an era where populism was as much a technological phenomenon as a political one, instantaneous, global, and algorithmic. Leaders learned to wield emotion like a weapon, while citizens navigated a digital landscape where engagement often substituted for reason. The stakes were higher than ever, and the theater of politics had become inseparable from the screens in our pockets.
Populism has always thrived on simplicity. A nation in crisis, a villain to blame, a savior to follow. From Mussolini to Trump, the formula has remained remarkably consistent. Emotion over reason, spectacle over substance. But in the 21st century, as populism goes digital and global, the consequences for democratic institutions, governance, and society have become unprecedented. Democracy is a fragile system. It relies on shared norms, trust in institutions, and the belief that the rules apply equally to all. Populism, by contrast, thrives on breaking those norms. It encourages the idea that the people are sovereign and that checks and balances, courts, and independent institutions are obstacles to their will. In theory, democracy promises participation and equality. In practice, populism can turn participation into chaos and equality into suspicion. The first signs of this crisis are often subtle. Leaders frame opposition voices as illegitimate, media outlets as enemies, and bureaucrats as corrupt. Slowly, the boundaries between fact and narrative blur. Institutions designed to mediate conflict, courts, parliaments, regulatory bodies, are portrayed as tools of an elite conspiring against the majority. Over time, trust erodes. Citizens begin to doubt the impartiality of elections, the integrity of law enforcement, and the fairness of public policy. Consider the case of Hungary under Viktor Orbán. Once celebrated as a post-communist success story, Hungary illustrates how populists can use democratic institutions to consolidate power. Through constitutional changes, control over media, and judicial appointments, Orbán reshaped the state from the inside. Laws remained ostensibly legal, elections technically free, yet the checks and balances that are the hallmark of liberal democracy gradually weakened. What appears lawful can be authoritarian in effect. Similarly, in Turkey, Recep Erdogan leveraged both electoral success and emergency powers to centralize authority. Independent judges, journalists, and academics faced intimidation. Constitutional amendments extended presidential powers. Political pluralism remained in form, but was hollowed in practice. Here, populism did not overthrow democracy, it re-engineered it to favor a single leader and a curated narrative of the people's will. Populism's assault on institutions is not limited to formal structures. Civil society, universities, and independent research bodies also become targets. Leaders frame dissent as betrayal, criticism as elitism, and expertise as disconnected from the real people. Knowledge and authority, once respected, are treated as obstacles to emotional connection and political performance. This erosion of institutional authority creates a cycle of dependency. Citizens, frustrated with bureaucracies and technocrats, increasingly turn to strongmen figures for solutions.
Leaders respond with more centralization, promising efficiency, accountability, and responsiveness, yet they deepen institutional weakness. Democracy survives in name, but in practice it becomes a theater, a platform for performance rather than deliberation. Alongside institutional weakening, populism thrives on division. Not merely political disagreement, but deep cultural and emotional polarization. Populists amplify fears, economic, social, cultural, and transform them into identity politics. Citizens are no longer voters, they are tribes. Loyalty becomes a moral imperative. Dissent is betrayal. Nuance is dangerous. The United States provides a vivid example. Social media platforms designed for engagement magnify differences between groups. Outrage-driven algorithms created echo chambers where opposing perspectives rarely met. Political affiliation became a marker of identity, not policy preference. Populist leaders capitalized on this, portraying opponents as existential threats rather than competitors in governance. Polarization is rarely accidental. Populists cultivate narratives of crisis, of corruption, foreign threats, or moral decay. They present themselves as the sole defenders of a threatened people. By appealing to fear and emotion, they convert pluralism into binary conflict. Us versus them, loyal versus traitor, insiders versus outsiders. The result is not just political division, but social fragmentation. Families, communities, and institutions become arenas of mistrust. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro's rhetoric during his presidency inflamed divisions over race, class, and public health. In the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs transformed crime prevention into a moral crusade, pitting citizens against each other and normalizing violence as political currency. Populists often exploit crises, pandemics, economic recessions, migration flows, turning uncertainty into opportunity. Emotional resonance outweighs empirical truth. The digital era intensifies this polarization. Fake news, conspiracy theories, and targeted messaging allow populists to manufacture crises at scale. A single viral post can reinforce fear, spread misinformation, and mobilize followers in minutes. The speed and reach of modern communication create feedback loops that magnify extremism. Populism becomes self-reinforcing. Outrage drives engagement, engagement drives amplification, amplification drives legitimacy. Trust, once the foundation of governance, becomes a casualty. Citizens lose faith not only in politicians, but in media, academics, scientists, and even fellow citizens. Public discourse fragments into separate realities. Common ground, the essence of democratic compromise, shrinks. Politics ceases to be negotiation, it becomes performance for one's tribe. While populism thrives on emotion, it often intersects with material conditions. Economic insecurity, stagnating wages, job loss, inequality, provides fertile ground for grievance politics. Populist leaders are skilled at transforming economic frustration into political loyalty. They identify scapegoats, blame elites, immigrants, or foreign powers, and promise a return to prosperity through decisive leadership. The 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath offered a global case study. Across Europe, North America, and Latin America, populists blamed bankers, bureaucrats, and trade deals for stagnation. In Italy, the Five-Star Movement harnessed anti-establishment anger. In Spain, Podemos rose on a platform of inequality and corruption. In the U.S., Trump leveraged economic grievances in the Rust Belt to win support among disaffected voters. Yet populism often solves grievances symbolically rather than structurally. Tariffs, executive orders, and public spectacles offer immediate satisfaction, but rarely address systemic issues like automation, global supply chains, or institutional inefficiency. The solution is always framed as the leader's personal action rather than collective reform. Citizens feel empowered, yet the underlying problems remain. This creates cycles of expectation and disappointment, a crisis of both governance and trust.
Populism is no longer confined to individual nations. Its strategies, successes, and failures travel across borders. Digital media allows leaders to learn from each other, replicate tactics, and amplify narratives globally. The consequences are both geopolitical and cultural. Consider Hungary and Poland. Orbán and the Law and Justice Party observed digital campaigns, anti-immigration rhetoric, and the cultivation of nationalist sentiment abroad. They applied these lessons to local contexts, reshaping electoral strategy, media control, and judicial oversight. In Latin America, populists like Bolsonaro and Andrés Manuel López Obrador studied European and North American precedents to craft hybrid appeals, combining nationalism, charisma, and digital engagement. Populism also affects international diplomacy. Leaders who rely on domestic popularity rather than institutional norms may prioritize short-term victories over long-term strategy. Alliances shift, treaties weaken, and norms of conduct erode. Foreign policy becomes performative, often reactive to media cycles and domestic outrage rather than structured negotiation. The stakes are higher in a connected world. One viral statement can spark conflict, economic instability, or diplomatic crises. Globalization, paradoxically, both fuels and constrains populism. Economic interdependence creates grievances, outsourcing, trade deficits, immigration pressures, which populists exploit. Yet the same interdependence ensures that unilateral populist decisions have cascading consequences beyond borders. In this sense, modern populism is domestic in rhetoric but global in impact. Beyond institutions and geopolitics, the rise of populism has profound human consequences. Emotional manipulation reshapes public perception, drives social division, and normalizes intolerance. Violence, discrimination, and harassment often accompany political campaigns that rely on fear and scapegoating. Social cohesion frays. Mental health suffers as individuals navigate a climate of constant outrage and uncertainty. Education, science, and expertise are undermined. Young citizens grow up in societies where truth is contested, historical memory is manipulated, and civic participation is framed as tribal loyalty. Political literacy, once a pathway to empowerment, becomes insufficient to navigate a world of misinformation, algorithms, and emotional appeals. Yet, there is also resistance. Civil society, independent media, grassroots movements, and international organizations work to rebuild trust, educate citizens, and provide platforms for fact-based dialogue. Populism, though powerful, is not invincible. Awareness, accountability, and institutional resilience remain vital tools to counter the worst excesses of emotional politics. The 21st century has shown that populism is both ancient and modern. It is rooted in human emotion, tribal identity, and the desire for certainty, yet it has evolved alongside technology, media, and globalization. Populist leaders harness fear, hope, and spectacle, leveraging both institutions and networks to consolidate power. Democracy, institutions, and social cohesion are under unprecedented pressure. Polarization, digital amplification, and global interdependence have created a new ecosystem where populism thrives, and where ordinary citizens, even unintentionally, participate in its reproduction. Yet, history offers lessons. Populism rises when institutions are weak, inequality is high, and citizens feel unheard. It recedes when accountability is enforced, pluralism is valued, and truth regains authority. The challenge for the modern world is to balance emotion with reason, spectacle with substance, and leadership with legitimacy. In this sense, the crisis of populism is not only political, it is a test of society itself. It asks whether we can remain committed to democracy, critical thinking, and shared norms, even as the allure of simplicity, charisma, and emotional certainty
grows ever stronger. The story is ongoing. The actors change, the platforms evolve, and the tactics adapt, but the core remains the same. Politics is human. Humans are emotional, and emotion, if left unchecked, can reshape the destiny of nations. Populism is not just a method of leadership. It is a lens through which we understand power, identity, and society in the modern age. And in the global, digital, and fractured world of the 21st century, its lessons are more urgent than ever.
Populism is never isolated. It thrives in moments of upheaval, uncertainty, and crisis. Economic recessions, pandemics, mass migrations, and political scandals all create fertile ground for leaders who offer certainty in the midst of chaos. Populists understand a simple truth. Crisis magnifies emotion, diminishes scrutiny, and amplifies the appeal of decisive authority. The 2008 global financial crisis provides a vivid example. Banks collapsed, governments scrambled to save economies. Millions of ordinary citizens faced unemployment, lost homes, and shattered trust. In the United States, Europe, and Latin America, populist movements seized on this collective anxiety. They framed the crisis as the fault of corrupt elites, bankers, and foreign actors. Their message was clear. Ordinary citizens had been betrayed, and only a bold leader could restore order. In Greece and Spain, austerity measures imposed by international institutions fueled anger. Political parties, once seen as credible, were rejected by voters. Citizens turned to radical alternatives, both left-wing and right-wing populists, who promised to bypass technocrats and deliver immediate relief. Populism, in this context, was both emotional and practical. It offered a narrative of justice alongside the promise of material solutions, however symbolic or temporary. Populism also responds to health crises, as seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. Leaders in multiple countries leveraged fear and uncertainty to consolidate power, shape narratives, and control information. Decisions were framed not merely as policy, but as moral imperatives. Citizens were asked to trust authority unquestioningly, to follow leaders not because of expertise, but because of their projected strength. In some cases, misinformation and denial were used strategically to maintain loyalty. Crisis, in short, magnified populism's reach, influence, and intensity. Populism is not confined to domestic politics. It carries significant implications for international relations, security, and conflict. Leaders who derive authority from emotional legitimacy may prioritize short-term displays of power over long-term diplomacy. Nationalism, fear of outsiders, and zero-sum thinking become hallmarks of foreign policy. Russia under Vladimir Putin illustrates the convergence of populism, nationalism, and assertive international strategy. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was not only a geopolitical maneuver, but also a performance for domestic audiences. By framing the intervention as protection for Russian-speaking populations and restoration of historical territory, Putin reinforced national pride while consolidating power at home. Simultaneously, the move challenged international norms, prompting sanctions and diplomatic pushback, and revealing the fragility of post-Cold War order. Similarly, populist rhetoric has influenced U.S. foreign policy. Leaders who emphasize America first or similar nationalist agendas often adopt transactional approaches to alliances, international agreements, and conflict resolution. Traditional institutions, such as NATO, the United Nations, and multilateral trade organizations, are portrayed as obstacles or even threats. While this can generate short-term political gains, it risks destabilizing global frameworks built on cooperation, predictability, and trust. In the Middle East, populist movements have interacted with long-standing regional tensions. Leaders who leverage identity politics, religious symbolism, and anti-elite rhetoric often amplify sectarian divisions. Domestic audiences are mobilized through narratives of historical grievance, while foreign policy becomes an extension of domestic emotional appeal. The result is a cycle of conflict and escalation, where internal legitimacy and external confrontation are intertwined. Modern populism intersects with technology, creating new forms of influence and conflict.
Hybrid warfare, the combination of conventional military operations, cyber attacks, disinformation, and political manipulation, are increasingly shaped by populist tactics. Leaders use social media, state-controlled outlets, and targeted messaging to achieve strategic objectives without direct confrontation. In Ukraine, Russia's approach exemplified this trend. Beyond military action, the Kremlin deployed disinformation campaigns to shape both domestic and international perceptions. Propaganda narratives were crafted to appeal to emotions: fear of outsiders, nostalgia for past glory, and mistrust of Western institutions. Populist tools, charismatic messaging, simple slogans, and moral framing were central to the strategy. The result? Influence extended beyond borders, destabilizing neighboring nations while maintaining domestic approval. Hybrid tactics are not limited to military conflict. Cyber operations, election interference, and misinformation campaigns increasingly blur the line between domestic populism and international strategy. Leaders exploit vulnerabilities in social systems, media networks, and civic trust to achieve both political and strategic objectives. In this sense, populism becomes a global instrument of influence, shaping events far beyond national borders.
Populism also reshapes the global economy. Trade wars, sanctions, protectionism, and unilateral policy decisions often arise from emotionally driven governance rather than systemic analysis. Leaders may prioritize domestic approval over international stability, resulting in economic shocks with far-reaching consequences. Consider tariffs imposed during nationalist campaigns in North America and Europe. While framed as protection for local workers, these measures often disrupt global supply chains, inflate consumer costs, and provoke retaliation. Similarly, sanctions, a favored tool of populist foreign policy, can stabilize domestic narratives while causing hardship abroad, creating cycles of instability and retaliation. Populist economic policy is frequently short-term and symbolic. It relies on visible action over structural reform, reinforcing the perception of responsiveness while leaving underlying systemic challenges unaddressed. Inequality, automation, and technological disruption persist, often exacerbated by policies designed more for emotional impact than long-term sustainability. Beyond economics and geopolitics, populism profoundly affects social cohesion and cultural life. Leaders appeal to identity, heritage, and historical memory to cultivate loyalty. This often creates divisions within societies, framing citizenship as a moral or emotional test. Minorities, immigrants, and dissenting voices are cast as threats to national integrity or cultural continuity. The result is a society in which trust fractures along identity lines. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members may inhabit different realities defined by allegiance rather than shared facts. Education, science, and expertise are undermined when they conflict with emotionally driven narratives. Youth grow up in societies where truth is subjective and loyalty often outweighs reason. Populism's cultural consequences are subtle but enduring. Symbols, rituals, and spectacles, from mass rallies to digital campaigns, reinforce group identity. Emotional resonance becomes more powerful than empirical knowledge. Over time, national narratives are rewritten, with selective memory and myth replacing nuance. Populism reshapes not only politics, but the very story a society tells about itself. Despite its power, populism is not invincible. Civil society, independent media, legal institutions, and international organizations provide counterweights. Awareness campaigns, civic education, and technological literacy can empower citizens to recognize manipulation, verify information, and hold leaders accountable. History demonstrates that populism recedes when institutions are resilient, pluralism is respected, and citizens have access to independent sources of information. Germany after World War II rebuilt democratic institutions and civic culture, limiting the space for authoritarian populism.
In Scandinavia, strong social safety nets, transparency, and trust in government reduce vulnerability to emotional appeals. Globalization, while exploited by populists, also provides tools for resistance. International networks, transnational media, and global cooperation offer mechanisms to counter disinformation, pressure leaders to uphold norms, and protect vulnerable populations. Digital platforms, if responsibly managed, can support civic engagement rather than amplified division. Populism, then, is both a challenge and a mirror. It exposes institutional weakness, social inequality, and the emotional vulnerabilities of citizens. Addressing populism requires more than political opposition. It demands cultural, institutional, and educational resilience. Looking forward, populism will remain a central feature of global politics. Emotional appeal, identity politics, and spectacle are inherent to human society. Yet the tools and platforms have evolved. Social media, artificial intelligence, and global connectivity amplify its reach, speed, and intensity. Populism in the future will likely be more digital, more transnational, and more instantaneous. Information will travel at unprecedented speeds, narratives will be hyper-personalized, and emotional appeals will be engineered with precision. Citizens will be both audience and participant, co-creating movements in real time. At the same time, awareness is growing. Scholars, technologists, and policymakers study the mechanisms of influence, seeking safeguards against manipulation. Civic education, fact-checking networks, and algorithmic transparency may mitigate the most extreme effects of emotional politics. Ultimately, populism presents a choice for societies. Left unchecked, it can erode institutions, inflame conflict, and destabilize nations. Managed wisely, it can serve as a corrective, highlighting grievances, motivating civic engagement, and catalyzing reform. Its consequences are neither predetermined nor uniform. They depend on the resilience, wisdom, and vigilance of citizens and institutions. Populism is a test of democracy, of social cohesion, and of the global order. It asks whether we can balance emotion with reason, leadership with accountability, and spectacle with substance. The challenge of the 21st century is to navigate these tensions, to recognize the power of populism without surrendering to its dangers. As the world continues to confront crises, conflicts, and the accelerating pace of change, populism will remain a force, shaping politics, influencing societies, and redefining the possibilities of leadership. The curtain has risen, the stage is global, and the performance is ongoing. In the end, understanding populism is not just a matter of politics, it is a lens on humanity itself, its fears, its hopes, and its enduring desire for certainty in an uncertain world.
The story of populism is not just history, it is happening now. It shapes governments, societies, and the choices we make every day. Understanding its roots, its methods, and its consequences empowers us to see the world more clearly. If this journey through history, power, and influence has given you insight, there's more to explore. Subscribe to our channel to follow every chapter of this global story. Dive deeper into the events, the leaders, and the forces that continue to shape nations. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts. Ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Because understanding is the first step toward change, and awareness is the first act of responsibility. The past teaches, the present warns, and the future awaits. Be part of the journey. Watch, learn, and engage.